So we will get started. We are looking at Colin Stephenson's Merrily on High, and we've been going along 2 chapters at a time. So today we're looking at chapter 5, Chichester, and this is basically seminary years. And then after that, chapter 6, which is his first placement after ordination, Cowley, St. John. So beginning at Chichester, this is going to be hard for me to say. And if anyone is watching from across the pond, you're going to be laughing at me. Mm-hmm. Chichester.
Maybe it's Chester.
Chester?
You know how they're always, they take a long word and pronounce it like a
Well,
short word.
I was walking around Oxford for 2 days before I figured out that Magdalen College and Magdalen College are the same thing. So who knows? Yeah. Chester. Oh.
And Worcester has 3 vowels.
Worcester. But he begins by making a reference to kind of how it was in the old days with ordination. And it's interesting that he begins the chapter by saying, you know, I don't ever remember talking to my bishop about ordination.
Yeah, didn't talk about it.
Now, he's already mentioned kind of how he fell enamored with the idea and was very captivated by monasticism with his early encounters with those hermits out there. And he says, I made up my mind. I wanted to be ordained. I went to a theological college. Now, that's a fairly recent thing in England. I'm thinking like maybe the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. Not quite sure exactly. But it used to be just you went to university and that was sufficient.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to get a certain degree, I don't think. But then they got more kind of systematically organized about these things, and they developed theological colleges. It also might have been contemporary with the development of various trade schools and professional schools. So he says, you know, I knew I wanted to be ordained. I found a college to go to. I found a curacy and a prospective boss in a parish to be at once I got ordained. All I just need is for a bishop to swing by and lay hands on me. And
all lined up.
he says the prospective vicar, his future boss at the parish, says, all I needed was the bishop to be informed of the date of ordination. Or no, I guess the bishop would inform him of the date of ordination. And he says, you know, back in the old days, every bishop was kind of a law unto himself in the matter of whom he ordained. That really is still the case. Not nearly as much as it used to be, but there are places in our jurisdiction and other ones around here where you can read for orders and you can just kind of study with a mentor and read some books and hey, you're good to go. Or maybe you come from some other background and you just do a little shaping up and hey, you're good to go. It just kind of depends, especially as seminary gets more and more expensive and thus kind of out of reach, especially for a second career type of person, because it's already an enormous investment personally to just pick up and move somewhere where you're not going to have any income for 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's a problem. It's a difficulty, and there have been creative solutions, but there really is no substitute for in-person learning and being a part of a worshiping, disciplined, formative community. I had a neighbor at seminary. I think it might have been when I came to visit as a prospective student, that he put it something like, you know, a lot of this stuff you really learn by osmosis. You know, it doesn't come out of a book. It's not in a classroom. You just kind of absorb it by hanging around here for a couple of years. You know, it soaks in. And I can really see that, you know. There's a lot of stuff you just miss. And I encounter that again and again when I meet other clergy who are recently ordained and they're kind of fresh to the Anglican tradition and they didn't go to a seminary like I did. And even then, not every seminary is the same, you know. A little plug for Nashotah House here. And, you know, there'll be very simple kind of questions and problems that I'm asked about. And I think, well, yeah, I guess you didn't really, you're not going to read that anywhere. It's just kind of something you pick up along the way. But you didn't go along that way, so you didn't pick it up. And he reminisces and says, back in the old days, all you needed was a university degree, and we've just gone so far to try to make it right, but I'm not sure it's even worth it. Do we end up with a better product than we did back then? I don't know. He says he's surprised at himself that he didn't go to St. Stephen's House, because I guess that was regarded as, the highest of the high church seminaries, or the most Catholic of the Anglo-Catholic seminaries. I did go over to England as a prospective student to visit St. Stephen's House, and would have perhaps gone there, but we couldn't figure out. At that time, St. Stephen's House was not a part of the university, and because of that, they weren't approved by the U.S. Department of Education, I guess, for student loans. So it would have made it extraordinarily difficult to get any borrowed funding that I needed. So that just kind of put the kibosh on that. But I'm happy the way it turned out. But it was neat to be able to see this place that he's talking about. Now, at that time, it was in a different location. Since then, St. Stephen's House has moved to, ironically, St. John the Evangelist, sort of the main abbey church of the Cowley Fathers. So the Cowley Fathers have dwindled, and they moved to London, their last group, and they have this fairly large church and this housing kind of dormitory, and so it was a very good fit for St. Stephen's House, so they moved there. And supposedly there's a uniquely St. Stephen's House cassock with 39 buttons. And the rumor is that they represent the 39 articles. The other explanation was that they are the 39 lashes from the scourging. That, allegedly 40 lashes was fatal, so they back it off just a hair, give you 39 lashes. But of course, being in an Anglican context, they figure 39 buttons or 39 articles. So if you don't like a particular article, you leave that button unbuttoned. So there was always you would be noticed if you left a particular button unbuttoned. And then he said, we much despised double-breasted cassocks or Anglican cassocks, which we thought a sign of moderation, and which we called maternity gowns. I've heard that before. I do have 2 Anglican cassocks. I wear one because it's good to get in and out of, and I just use that one for wearing underneath the vestments on weekdays, and then I wear the more formal one on Sundays. He talks about how he found Chichester, or Chester. A friend who was with me when on passing through Chichester, we went to look at the chapel of the Theological College, says that the moment I saw it, I said, this is where I'm coming. So I fear it was tat, which tipped the scales. Now, if that doesn't ring a bell, tat is like all the stuff, There was, for a while, we had a congregation join our diocese from Little Rock, and the rector there was very low church, but he loved the tat. So he loved all the vestments and getting a new thurible and all the stuff, the churchy stuff, So this is what won Colin Stephenson over. And yet, who of my temperament could have resisted that chapel? It had everything I had come to consider essential to the true faith: 6 candles on the high altar, a lady chapel, and a requiem chapel. And presiding over it all, under a canopy, a very large statue of St. Richard of Chichester, which I had, I believe, started life as St. Patrick. So it was a repurposed statue.
Yeah.
And I tried to find a picture of this, but it's not around anymore, or nobody has a picture of it online. The Theological College is not around anymore, so its property has been folded into the regular College of Chichester. and I couldn't find anything about it on their website. He talks about making a joke about wood and stone. The ornate decoration was the work of the previous principal. Principal is like the dean of the school or the president. Herman Leonard Pass, a very distinguished convert from Judaism, who had been led to baptism through the influence of Canon Wood of Cambridge and Darwell Stone, so that an undergraduate paper printed an unkind cartoon with the legend, "The heathen in his blindness bows down to wood and stone." Although he became an Anglo-Catholic, it was his Oriental love of splendor which was expressed in the lushness of the chapel and the yards of gold lace sewn into all the vestments. As principal of the college, it was not only because he had been a Jew that his students nicknamed him Jehovah, for he lived in awesome remoteness, and when he left his rooms, he was preceded through the college by a manservant, opening the doors and proclaiming, "Gentlemen, the principal." He would issue dispensations from fasting or abstinence from his stall in chapel like a medieval pope. It was he who had given the college its very ultra-Catholic tradition, but by the time I joined, he had retired to be a canon residentiary at the cathedral. He was a tall, I like this description, he was a tall, graceful man with a face like a very handsome monkey, which could be wonderfully expressive. And then he talks about how he got cold feet. He was about to go to school, and then all of a sudden he just kind of gets nervous and goes AWOL and sends a telegram saying, "Sorry, I'm not going to make it," and just kind of goes backpacking through Europe. But then he sort of gets that out of his system and settles down and comes back and picks up at the next semester. Interesting, he's in Paris, and there's the World Expo going on there. And he said the Vatican State had a pavilion, and in it I saw for the first time some of the fruits of the liturgical revival, which puzzled me considerably. The central altar had it's odd that they would have a church exhibit. I guess it really is about the liturgical movement that they want to, because a lot of times the World Exposition is, all these things that will be the wave of the future, what the kitchen of tomorrow will be like, and new cars and stuff, and what the church of tomorrow will be like. And so the Vatican had an exposition there. He said the central altar had no candles, none. And all of these were right on target. And the vestments displayed looked as if they had been knitted out of string, while the chalices were like rose bowls. It was just a thing of the time, very fond of these very wide-mouthed chalices, like a bowl on a stick. Knowing nothing but the sandwich board-shaped vestments and jewel-encrusted vessels of the Brighton churches, I could hardly believe that the things I regarded as low church were being proudly paraded by Rome herself. I'm surprised I was not more shaken by it. Dr. Darwell Stone said to me when I was a curate in Oxford, "I constantly see pictures of the Pope blessing Gothic vestments, but I notice that he always wears the Latin ones." Of course, this is, I guess that would be up until John the 23rd. I don't remember ever seeing John the 23rd in any Gothic vestments. Paul VI, certainly, and all the ones thereafter. He says he loved seminary life. It was one of the happiest periods of his life.
Yeah.
He mentions the dean of the cathedral, and it made me think back to the dean of my seminary, Dean Gary Chris, whom I love dearly, but I don't think he likes me very much. But there's a lot of similarities here. It says, a chief butt of our ridicule were the lovers of ceremonial, such as Dean Duncan Jones had established in Chichester Cathedral, who were very intense about it, so that it was easy to tease them. We called the vestments they liked tents, their long surplice nightgowns, and said that when they served, they held their hands as if they were urinating. I guess that means they're holding them together but very low, rather than up, in front of the chest, kind of relaxed. But I remember I think I remember only one sort of Sarum versus Western quip. Dean Chris was, he would kind of hold seminars to sort of fill us in on stuff we wouldn't necessarily get in the classroom. And this was like, you know, laying out your vestments and finding your way through the books and things like that. And so he's going over how to lay out the vestments, how to fold things. And it's like, so where did you put the Beretta? And he gives me this look. I'll tell you where to put it. And then on page 77, he talks about kind of the teasing that devolved toward married clergy. He says, I'm amused by the fact that most of my fellow students who said the worst things about the married clergy are themselves happily married men today, which leads me to suspect that when anyone is violently anti a thing, it shows that he has mighty inclinations in that direction. And I think that is very often true, certainly not always true. He says, some of the clergy I knew in my youth were very intense about celibacy, and Father Percy Marin Wilson would always behave as if the wives of priests were not there. Mercifully, they usually thought him either deaf or absent-minded, as he would wear a beatific smile while looking right through them. He adopted the same tactic if anyone tried to speak to him before he had said Mass. So he gets in the zone, his recollection. And I've often had that situation like, why are you talking to me right now? We're supposed to walk out here in like a minute and a half. Yeah. He says, Father Bristow of Bagborough, one of the great country parish priests, even went so far as to try to persuade clergy wives to leave their husbands, and boasted as a virtue of the separations he had caused. Yeah. If one was a married clergyman, it was very unwise to let one's wife go to one of his retreats. I don't think there's very many of those around anymore. And also that was one thing where it was back in the days where, the churchmanship party line, you had to sort of more vigorously fight for it. And so there was a lot more investment in things like celibacy among the priesthood and Anglican circles. Not as much anymore, although you still find it some. Now, and unfortunately, it's kind of evolved or devolved into more of a gay, straight thing. Yeah. Whether or not it's the reality, a lot of times people, when they encounter a single Anglican priest, will just make the assumption, unless he has a wife. And that's unfortunate.
That's a shame. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the kind of rigorous monastic routine they had every day. They'd be up at 7 a.m. for matins, and they would go all through the day to Compline at 10 p.m. and bed by 12, I guess. And of course, he says, today, nobody would ever put up with this. It would be too intense. The student of today would find this order of things very repressive, but I cannot help but thinking that the discipline was good for us, as it did establish certain habits of piety and study. The moment we were launched into parishes, we were swamped with activity and looked back on the ordered life of the college with some nostalgia. And I can basically identify with that. There are many times when I pine for the old days in seminary when I didn't. In some ways, I had more to do, but in other ways, I didn't have as much to do, and life was more rigid in some ways, but liberating in others. And I was also surrounded by, peers and friends, and it was refreshing. Also, another thing that he doesn't point out is that there are so many married students and second career students, so it wouldn't really work the way it did once upon a time. Because once upon a time, you definitely went to seminary before you got married, if you did, and you were expected to stay single throughout the whole thing. There was only single housing. There was no married student housing, and that gradually came in. I don't know, probably starting in the 50s or 60s. but not until then. He says, page 79, we all admired the principal, the dean, very much, and he was a great example to those training for the priesthood. He said Mass with extreme recollection, and was obviously a man of prayer. He appeared vague, and was indeed very absent-minded. He was once seen walking down the street in an overcoat, but no trousers, having forgotten to put on his cassock, with the biretta on his head clearly showed he had intended to do. Yet he knew everything that went on in the college and was not fooled for a moment by the deceptions we thought we were getting away with. His rebukes were always mild and framed in the plural. We must try and be more punctual. But he could be very firm and was insistent that the clergy could at least have good manners. And I think that's the kind of priest that you need as a dean of a seminary. You know, he doesn't have to be an academic. He has to, of all of the, you got clergy all over the place at a seminary. Throw a rock in any direction, you'll hit a priest. But what you want in the dean is a pastor. You want somebody who is mentoring and forming young future priests. And so I think that's the most important thing. He says on page 80, bishops used to talk pompously about the tradition of sound scholarship in the Church of England, not wishing to face the fact that it vanished years ago. And that was back in the 30s, 20s or something like that. It certainly is long gone now. Anglican and Episcopal clergy have a reputation of being sort of on the lower end of theological sophistication and training. We have pretty much the same schooling requirements as a lot of other places, but I think it's less intense. And also, I know Lutherans, at least, maybe some others, have 4-year seminary, and we have 3. But I think that may be that 1 year is an internship, and whereas we do an internship in, over the course of a summer or something like that. He says, I became the master of ceremonies at the college and can remember contriving a canopy of 4 white poles, a length of brocade and brass doorknobs. It was carried over the sacrament on Maundy Thursday, and I felt that I had struck a great blow for the faith. The ceremonies of Holy Week were carried out in the Church of St. Bartholomew, which was close to the college and is now its chapel. The vicar in those days said, I try to put on one new thing each year. He did, and lost part of his congregation each time. The only thing that's puzzling about that is it seems like most Holy Weeks, year by year, is like, okay, what did we do last year? It's almost hard to remember if you did change anything because you're not quite sure what it was you did. He talks about, now this is a different world, but this was real, top of page 81. During the college centenary, when many old students returned, altars were put up in every part of the buildings, and one came out of one's room to find a priest saying Mass at the end of the passage, genuflected, and hurried off to the bathroom. So they would stick altars everywhere, down the hallways and in various rooms that, were classrooms or lounges. And Nashotah House was this way. It used to be that every priest on the staff said his daily Mass before they came together for chapel as a community.
Wow.
And I don't know but they probably did never have any ordained students because they were probably primarily at that time just a kind of a trade school for those studying for the priesthood. Nowadays they have different kinds of students. But of course that all went out with the liturgical movement, so you don't do your own Mass before you have the community Mass. He talks about George Bell, the bishop, a big man, regarded as something of a saint by the confessional church in Germany. And George Bell has come into the news more recently because, sadly, to say he was accused of sexual impropriety with a young girl back in the 40s, something like that, 50s. But after, and so he was the Bishop of Chichester, and so his successor, the complaint was brought to his successor because it was a long time after he died. So it was supposedly a young girl. So the complaint was brought, and the bishop apologized to the family. They were paid a settlement. But then the church commission that's been established, I forget what it's called, whatever. They looked into it more closely, and they're like, wait a minute. None of this makes any sense. None of this is plausible. All of the details she adds, they don't add up. And so they ended up apologizing to the family of George Bell. And so it was kind of a big mess, frankly, and sullied his name. And that's unfortunate, too. He talks on page 82 about the feeling and the atmosphere when war is approaching. Mm-hmm. So he says, during my second year at Chichester, and I'm guessing that they are in a 3-year course of studies like we do now, but I don't know. So during his second year, the threat of war began to appear on the horizon. The events leading up to Munich came as a great shock, for having grown up in the years after the Great War, WW1, I fully believed that another conflict of that sort was impossible. And, of course, that's how the war was built, the war to end all wars. What's your favorite world war?
Yeah. Yeah, which one? That one.
He says, it's extraordinary that in the year after Munich, most of us came to accept the idea of war as inevitable. And so there's this dramatic evolution, There's these drum beats of war, but there's no way that war is going to come to us. We're done with war. But then, yes, it looks like that's a foregone conclusion. And it made me think back to my own experience at seminary. So I started in 1999, and so I guess it was my second year, in 2001, September. And I had gone far enough in Hebrew in college that I could test out of the class, and so I had an empty period right after breakfast. And so I was wandering back, and as often is the case, I'll duck into the financial office where the secretary's there, and a lot of times she'd like to visit with the students, and she had a little TV in there, and they were, somebody first had put on the TV in the refectory, and there was this one tower was smoking, and there was a report that a plane had flown into the tower, and then it came time, and everybody else had to go to class. And so I, heading back to the dorm, went by and ducked in to the financial aid office, and she had her TV on in there, and there were a couple of people gathered around. We were watching it. And then I think by this time the second plane had hit, and they were both on fire. So it was there in that office that I saw the first building collapse. And I remember thinking, I don't remember if I said it out loud, but I remember thinking to myself, I guess we're going to war. It's just kind of inevitable. You could see it right there. It was a reality. And so that's the experience that he has as well. He says, talk about reality crashing in. There was a German student, an ex-Lutheran pastor, page 83, at the college, and one morning the police came for him while we were having high mass, in which he was acting as subdeacon. They stood at the back of the chapel with their caps in their hands till we had finished the mass. We were all very upset when he was taken off for internment. Now I'm guessing that they had their German camps like we had our Japanese camps. Is that the case? Do you know anything about that?
I presume yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because this is the first I've heard about it.
German non-combatants were held in special camps. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then he talks about, the prime minister was giving his big speech. They went over to the church and started up the regular service. But then an extraordinary figure in a tin hat and gas mask appeared at the door and loudly blew a whistle, shouting, "Air raid warning red." And then so everybody kind of scatters, and And no one thought to inquire where I was supposed to shelter, and I remained alone in the church, writing in the register, "Service abandoned, owing to air raid warning," which I thought might be fascinating to future generations if we survived. So no one was quite sure exactly what was going to happen next, except that, war was inevitable. So what do you do till then? Well, it was time to finish college and go off and get started with his life, and whatever happened, happened. So he went ahead and went into the parish. And he noted that at Oxford, there were more and more women and children pouring in from London because they sent them out to the country where there would be less likelihood that they would be injured or killed in air raids and things like that. So then, chapter 6, Cowley, St. John. So this is the district, the neighborhood, I guess you'd say. That's the name of it. So he's going to be ordained a deacon first. He says the ordination was taken by the Bishop of Dorchester, who is known as Puffles. Puffles. For Bishop Kirk, who was the Bishop of Oxford, was ill. Puffles was a sweet, kind man, and I loved him dearly. How could you not love someone named Puffles? But he has absolutely no sense of the ridiculous, and always managed to make ceremonies a little hilarious by trying too hard to be dignified. And he says that the ordinations at Christ Church, which is the cathedral, it's also the chapel of the college, Christ Church College. He says ordinations there, since Kirk had become Bishop of Oxford, set a new liturgical standard, which has been copied by other dioceses, but at that time was a novelty to see an Anglican bishop in his own cathedral wearing all the stuff, all the traditional vestments, including gloves. Trying to get Bishop Reed to wear gloves. And I couldn't get Bishop Eicher to wear gloves. Bishop Ackerman will happily wear gloves.
Purple or white?
Well, they can either be white or they're the color of the vestments.
Oh, okay.
So they're red, green, what have you. All my youth, I had seen bishops from overseas in all their episcopal pomp at Anglo-Catholic churches in London, but it seemed wonderful to see an English diocesan behaving this way. Kirk was a great scholar, but it was only after he became a bishop that he displayed his taste for ritualism and paid little attention to the usual Anglican taste for moderation. He went around the diocese in a biretta and wore a cappa magna on occasions. Then he talks about he's nervous the day before his ordination. He felt sick. He worried he might have a headache, and for any excitement, he thought it was a liver attack, but he discovered many years later that it was a migraine that he was experiencing. So he's worried about having one of these liver attack headaches, so he took twice the maximum dose of Carter's little liver pills the night before on the principle of making doubly sure, and felt fine, if a little flatulent, the next day.
Yeah.
He talks about, and I can sort of identify the last evensong of the school year right after graduation. So after graduation, the new students at Nashotah House that have graduated, they get to wear their stuff, their hoods and what's the long black thing? Can't remember now. Anyway, the long black thing, tippet. And the ones that wanted to could wear their berettas. That was the one time of the whole experience where anyone was allowed to wear a beretta in chapel. So he says, that night I sat for the first time in a priest's stall at Saints Mary and John while solemn evensong was sung, very conscious of the brand new beretta on my head. What a party symbol it was, which I took on and off every time the Gloria was sung or the holy name mentioned. I would have found it hard to believe that day would come, as it has, when I wouldn't know where my beretta was if I wanted it. And that made me a little sad. He's kind of let some of these things go. And we'll come across that later in the book. It's very interesting, bottom of page 86. He talks about how the church feels. He became vicar later of St. Mary Magdalene. It was a much older church. But he talks about when he opens it in the morning, it feels kind of feeling full of life, even though he's alone. Whereas in comparison, the place where he was serving as a curate, Saints Mary and John, he often went to the church, right after it had just been full and everybody left. And yet it didn't have that kind of full of life feeling. And it's curious the way that happens sometimes, because you can sense that. I guess the test is, does everybody have the same sense? It's maybe one person it feels full of life and another person feels empty and dead. Who knows? Let's see. He talks about, I won't go into this, but back in the old days, there were a series of very prominent laymen who were very wealthy and very enthusiastic about the church and did great things for the church, building things and filling them with precious ornaments and statues and all kinds of things. Lord Halifax, the most prominent and famous of them. And he says he even took a chaplain with him on his honeymoon. And for the Oxford Movement Centenary in 1933, when he was a very old man, he had a great altar pavilion designed and built in his garden at enormous cost for a single high mass. And he talks about some of the others. He talks about training, liturgical training, page 89. When I first began saying Mass, I sometimes felt that I was doing it in a shop window. For if I put my hand slightly in the wrong place, I would hear the vicar give a sharp intake of breath and would guiltily move it. This was excellent training, for by the time I left the parish, I knew how to say Mass correctly without having to pay attention to the externals. Now all that's changed. It made me think of learning to drive. So I learned to drive in a Nissan Sentra that was completely unforgiving in terms of using the clutch and the stick shift. But it was great because, if I can drive that thing, I can drive anything.
Yep.
And so I got to the point where, I never made it hiccup or anything like that. It was just so smooth. So it was like excellent training. He talks about some oddities. He says there were 5 of us on the staff, 5 clergy on the staff of this church. And there's also, as a part of that, there's like a church plant, a daughter church. And so I guess one of the 5 is the priest in charge of that one. And he says, it was in fact, the priest in charge of the daughter church, which had been built far too close to the parish church, was Billy Favell, the most urbane of clergymen, who lived with his adorable mother in a hideous little brick house which had a hall attached. It was in fact a palace and a cathedral, for it had been built by a curious episcopus vagans, that is a wandering bishop, a bishop without a diocese, who claimed to be Bishop of Mercia. It was always said in Oxford that one must talk to him with one's hat on, or one was liable to find oneself rapidly ordained into his diocese. So these wandering bishops were known famously, infamously, for ordaining anyone and everyone that was interested. When Father Hack, this was their way of evangelizing England. When Father Hack was vicar of St. Thomas, a wandering bishop set up in the parish, and Hack gave out the notices, quote, "A gentleman who calls himself Bishop James has come to live in Hythe Bridge Street. I would like to make it clear that he is not in communion with the Church of England. He is not in communion with the Church of Rome. And as far as I know, he is in communion with no one, either in heaven or on earth." And you see these little churches today that are like that, where it's a bishop and a couple of people. Almost all of them are ordained, and it's their garage or something, a little chapel. And that's it. There's a very famous, infamous economics professor down in Austin, I believe. Talk about tat. I mean, he has the money to spend on that kind of stuff, and he has, coat of arms and all this kind of stuff. It's quite impressive, except for the lack of parishioners. He talks about being ordained to the priesthood, and he had part of his job was attending to the school children, I guess teaching religion classes or leading chapel services. When I was priested, the teacher said to the children, "You can now call Father, Father, and mean it, because he is really a father now." They looked at me with innocent eyes, but some of them were more sophisticated than she thought. And one little cherub came up to me afterward and said, "Who had the baby?" He talks about some of the nuns that he's encountered. Laleham Abbey, a sisterhood where the rooms were named after places in the gospel. Once I called, and the portress said, "Mother is playing the harp in Jerusalem," which for a moment made me wonder if this could be a tactful way of announcing her demise. And then he talks about how the monks from Nashtam had to be evacuated, and they were put up in the girls' school there. And he went to visit his cousin, who was from Nashtam. And he says all the rooms there were called after flowers. And at night, there was some activity as members of the community crept around, transferring the card reading "Pansy" to someone else's door. That was my favorite. And then Mulling Abbey in Kent. All the nuns had been evacuated, and during that time, he was put up to board for the night in the abbess's room. Years later, I was in a group of people who had all had some connection with Mulling, and I said, "I've slept in the abbess's bedroom." They obviously thought I was making a joke in the worst possible taste and changed the subject without giving me a chance to explain. Talks about how he knew a seminarian named Christmas, and so he wonders if he became Father Christmas, but he lost touch with him. And he talks about a friend of his, what's his name? Maybe this is Father Hack? I guess so. "It was he who insisted," this is page 94, "that I must recite the Roman breviary in Latin, provided me with a set, and showed me how to use them." I need somebody to show me how to use the old breviary, because I have several, but I haven't taken the couple of weeks to intensely study and figure out all the rules.
What does he mean by a set?
Well, usually because it's more than one volume because of the length of it.
Okay.
So I have one in Latin, and it's 2 volumes. And, each one of them is like 2,000 pages or something. So there's a lot of stuff in there. He had a private chapel at Parktown, and in it we would recite matins and lauds after an excellent dinner served with great elegance. The chapel, I need hardly say, had to be seen to be believed, and was dominated by a dressed image of Our Lady, the adornments of which he had made himself, after buying the ancient statue in Munich. The cult and title of Our Lady of Maternal Guidance was also his own invention. That's not a bad, Our Lady of Maternal Guidance.
Okay.
We could invoke that for our Gabriel's project here when we have educational classes for the young pregnant women.
Yeah.
He says, "I didn't get on very well with the Latin, and it was a great burden, but he would urge me on with patience and explain that it was better to recite the correct thing, even if one didn't understand it, than consent to the reduced prayer book office, which had been compiled with Protestant intent." And you might say, Cranmer, this is exactly the example he would point to and say, "This is what I'm talking about." I thought this was a great line. He was very censorious, chastising about those who took the sugar of Catholicism and neglected its disciplines. And I often have that same sentiment run through my head as well. And also, in a similar way, those who relish in tat or liturgical fancies and ritual stuff, but ignore the theology. The theology is the main thing. We're Anglo-Catholics because of doctrine, most of all, not because of ritual. The ritual flows out of what we believe. But often if you fall in love with the ritual, it doesn't necessarily flow the opposite direction because you get distracted by it. And but if you believe it in your heart, then it comes out in the way that you live your life. And he talks about this same priest that was so intense about all this stuff. He says later in life, he seldom dressed as a priest, and he would always, he'd make his friend get dressed up in a collar when they went anywhere. He seldom dressed as a priest. I never saw him reciting the breviary, and he always had some excuse why he couldn't say Mass. Sad. He talks about, page 95, gets around to actually covering his ordination to the priesthood. So Bishop Kenneth Kirk, and he is a great writer and a great thinker. He was a scholar, and he wrote several books, and there's a great one on confession. And I have a printout of that. Probably there are some online, Google Books, PDFs, or maybe Internet Archive or something like that. I'll see if I can find some links and put them on the video. And physically, he said Kirk was an impressive figure and performed ceremonies correctly with a slight air of boredom, which made him appear much like a Roman prelate. And then he talks about, I'm a little embarrassed to confess that I swore my ordination oaths on a Roman breviary. Since Alex had persuaded me to use it, that's the big Latin guy, I carried it around with me, as in order to get the office completed, I had to make use of every odd moment. When the registrar distributed the New Testaments for the taking of the oaths at the ordination, he passed me by, saying, "Well, I see you already have one." In any case, one was only required to assent to the 39 Articles. Canon Williams, who took the ordination retreat, is supposed to have said, "I assent to the 39 Articles as I assent to the Oxford Gas Works. I am aware of their existence. I am at the present moment engaged in no active plan for their destruction, but it does not mean that I approve of them." And then he talks about, really paints a nice, wonderful picture of saying his first Mass. He says, with great awe, early in the morning of the following day, the high altar had been decorated by the sisters with Madonna lilies. I was wearing a lace alb with red chasuble, which glittered like a beetle's skin and had been loaned by Alex. The organ was played without cessation by a brilliant organist, Bobby Mead, a Frenchman, who had been ordained into the Church of England, although he never displayed any particular affection for Anglicanism, and was what we call a breviary boy. I thought that was strange. Somebody who just probably independently wealthy and just wants to sit around and say his prayers.
and play the organ unceasingly.
And play the organ unceasingly. As a final touch, I had hired a professional tenor who sang at the offertory and during the communion. There was a large congregation to whom I gave blessings and commemoration cards in the approved continental manner. I did not carry a bouquet. I guess, Alex had carried a bouquet at his ordination. Somebody thought he was part of the wedding. But I had a rose on the altar, which I gave to my mother. So I had a rose that I gave at my ordination to my mother and my wife. He talks about the devoted women on page 98. I've never ceased to admire the single-minded devotion of the really converted high church woman. Some years ago, there was a tragic motor crash near Walsingham when a priest was killed and his devout women passengers horribly injured. I went to see them in the hospital where they were lying with almost everything broken except their necks. But their main worry was that they would have to have another vicar appointed who would not maintain the faith. And then he talks about Father DeWall. This is my favorite part of the book. So this is page 99. We had living in the parish a retired priest called Father DeWall, who was a gentle and whimsical character. He always wore a frock coat and top hat, into which in summer he would put a dock leaf to keep himself cool. I don't know what that means. He was one of a generation who lived their whole life in the Church of England while behaving as if it didn't exist. His active ministry had been spent as a curate at Barnes, where he and the vicar were lifelong friends, but unfortunately did not have the same sort of religion. Father de Wall ran a separate show in the side chapel, where he had sung Mass and Vespers, while Matins and Evensong were held in the main body of the church. I once asked him how he let people know about his services, and he replied, "Why, by postcard, of course." He was a complete nonconformist, for he had his own ideas about everything, and no power on earth could make him change them. But he always managed to get his own way by a gentle, mild persistence. He hated all things Sarum, but particularly Gothic vestments. And if he went into a church where they were being used, he would produce a card of safety pins and turn them into the Latin shape, as like as not ruining them completely. He used to go around saying Mass at different churches, but he would take a small bell, which he would hold between his fingers, and ring as he elevated the host, if there was no server, and a book which had cash written on the front, but which he called my missal, and had written himself. He never said anything but a votive Mass of St. Joseph, except on the very greatest of feasts. There had not been much to write in the book. "I can't think of why people will try to join in when one is saying Mass," he would remark. "If they try it with me, first I go fast, and then slow, and they don't keep it up." He says he came twice a week and said a late Mass at Saints Mary and John, where he was discovered by one of the sisters dragging a clean alb across the sacristy floor. When he saw he was observed, he said guiltily, "Oh dear, I do so hate clean linen." It was not always easy to find a server for him at the hour he liked to say Mass, so he would walk down the road, stopping people, raising his top hat and saying, "Excuse me, madam, but can you answer Mass? I don't care what your religion is, but can you answer Mass?" He liked to be asked to preach, but one never quite knew what vintage the sermon would be. And he surprised us one evening in 1940 by saying, I don't know what this reference is, "Now that the dear boys are coming back from Ladysmith." It's probably like a World War I reference or something.
Ladysmith, South Africa. So it's probably from the Boer Wars.
Okay.
Yeah.
He set up a ward of the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament, and it was a group of ladies that liked to make vestments for poor churches. And then when in Oxford, he would ask local vicars if he could have Vespers for the CBS in their church. And so they agreed. When they asked how many are coming, do you expect? He said, "Oh, bless my soul, they won't be here. They all live over there in Barnes. I'm just going to have it on their behalf." He says, "I asked him to be my confessor." I think this is my very favorite part of Father de Wall. "I asked him to be my confessor, and I found him very comforting, as he always went through my sins and made an excuse for each one. Should I confess to having murdered my aunt, he would say, 'Of course aunts are notoriously tiresome. I can't think of why more than them don't get themselves killed. In fact, it can hardly be counted as a sin at all.' If he could not think of no other excuse, he would put it down to daylight savings, which he hated, saying, 'With these ridiculous times and absurd arrangements, one can't be surprised at any fall from grace.' During his last illness, I went to see him in bed, with some hesitation, asked if he felt well enough to hear my confession. He at once took a purple stole out from under the pillow and put it on. When we had finished, he said contentedly, 'God bless my soul, I have enjoyed that.' Some of the Cowley fathers came to sing at his funeral and used the proper for a requiem from the Sarum Missal. I quite expected to hear a rap of protest from inside the coffin." He says the boss at his parish would look in the mirror and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the highest of us all?" And he was determined that he would always be higher than his curates. But he did claim his own victory for the faith when he persuaded the vicar to add the prayers after Mass, the Leonine prayers. He says, now I don't even remember how they go. And he wraps up the chapter very poignantly. He says, never, with great gratitude, never for a moment did I regret my decision to become a priest. I was father, in spite of my youth, greeted as such by the children, addressed so by those old enough to be mine, and who had been taught a reverence for the office of a priest, which made me feel that I must never do anything which would tarnish this image. And then moving on, happy as I was, there was a war on. All the time, young men from the parish were being called up. A number of my personal friends were already in the forces, which was very upsetting for anyone of my age. And he had mentioned earlier that clergy were exempt from the draft.
Yeah.
And so he closes out the chapter by saying, I simply, sort of like John the 23rd calling the council, I simply woke up one morning and said to myself, I'm going to join the Navy. So that's the next chapter, the Navy.
Chapter C, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. We'll continue on next time
Yeah.
when he joins the Navy.
When he joins the Navy.